Hey, it's Colleen with Rope and Resellers, and I am here for a What's It Worth video this week. And this week I am going to continue on sort of the craft thread. And I know I said I was done with craft threads, but then I went out searching to see what I could find in the local thrift stores for you guys to show you that you can just go to a thrift store and buy something cheap and flip it. And I found something, and it was a piece of fabric. So I decided that I was going to try to include this because I actually do know a fair bit about fabric since I'm a seamstress as well. This week I went to a thrift store and I saw this and I was like, well, that's pretty groovy. I wonder if it's vintage, which it wasn't, but it's pretty cool, right? I don't know. But then I flipped it over and looked on the selvage edge. I'll try to have a little picture in here of the actual selvage, but so on the selvage it says IKEA 2007. So this is just a yard of fabric, and it was $1.50, and I'm hoping to get $10 to $15 for it. The only bummer, and I took it off the hanger and looked for any kind of stains because it's not a very big piece, right? This is about 1 meter long or 1 yard. So it's actually, it's longer than a yard. It's longer than a yard. Like this is a yard, and it goes. But they took off the end of it. This should be a 45, I think these are, maybe a 60-inch wide piece of fabric, and they cut it. So unfortunately, it's not a full-size piece, but it is pretty long, and it is IKEA, and this is a popular pattern. So I don't think I'll have any trouble selling it. So anyway, I'm going to turn this $1.50 into hopefully $15. I always like to put a zero after whatever I buy, minimum, which is pretty good return on investment. So let's go over to the computer and have a look, and I'll show you some other things to look for when you're out in the thrift stores. Okay, so the first fabric I want to talk about is vintage fabric, because that's an area that I hold dear to my heart because I like selling vintage things. Sometimes I run across some pretty unusual stuff. I did want to point out just a couple examples really quick. So this is a Pepsi fabric. They have only 44 by 45, so it's 45 wide usually is one of the standard sizes, as well as 60 inches wide. So there's more your generic stuff that was sold in fabric stores, and then there was stuff that's more designer-lay wide. It's going to be wider a lot of times. They're used for upholstery. So this is just over a yard of fabric, and they got $50. But this is pretty phenomenal. If I saw something like this, so the things that are attractive about this is it's definitely groovy 70s, 1960s, mid-century, but it also has Pepsi, so it's going to appeal to Pepsi collectors as well as fabric collectors. It doesn't really matter. This just so happens to be cotton. I don't think the content would matter so much on that. Some of these other ones, you know, they're just, they have kind of a vintagey feel to them. But sometimes you can find, like, here's Power Rangers. If you recognize a character, so here's a Raggedy Ann fabric. So here's some Marvin the Martian, which is always really pretty popular. Sometimes you can find characters that you would recognize. So if you see it and you recognize the character and you know that they're from the 70s or 80s or 90s, they would be something worth picking up, because oftentimes fabric, you can get it at Goodwill for $1 or $2. They haven't caught on to the fabric thing yet. Just know that when I looked at this, the sell-through rate isn't super phenomenal, so you have to be a little picky and you have to look the vintage fabric up. Next, I want to show you some Ralph Lauren. So this sell-through rate is about 1/4 of everything that's listed gets sold through every 90 days, in theory, if you have the right thing. Ralph Lauren is, they sell clothing, obviously, but they also have a line of fabric, and the designer that I work for uses Ralph Lauren fabric, and I know it's really expensive. So oftentimes I will ask her not to tell me how much the fabric is before I cut into it, because it makes me nervous. So some of his fabric sells for $225 a yard. It's very, very expensive fabric. This one just so happens to be vintage, I guess. But usually what you're looking for is what's called the selvage, the edge of the fabric. You're going to see the manufacturer of the fabric and then who it's designed for. I'll show you in the next tab what that looks like, but this says Ralph Lauren right on it. So if it is Ralph Lauren, you know that they probably paid a good amount of money. They don't sell Ralph Lauren at Hancock's or, you know, Walmart or one of the cheaper places. It is only sold to high-end. You can order it online, but it's generally used by designers because it's pretty expensive stuff. So this is wool fabric. Now you're asking, Colleen, how the heck am I going to know whether it's wool or not? Well, I will show you in a little bit just how to look it up, but you do basically what's called a burn test, and it'll tell you what the content is. Quickly, if it burns all the way through and it becomes a fine ash, it's going to be cotton or wool, depending on what that looks like. If it melts, if it kind of curls up and melts, then you know it's some sort of plastic material. So quickly, that's what that is. But wool can also be a very expensive fabric. You can tell just by feeling. And my recommendation to you, if you have any interest in starting to sell fabric, is just go to a high-end fabric store or an interior designer store. Even Joann's in the back, they have designer fabrics, and just get a feel for what the different fabrics feel like. I mean, we know from clothing, whether it's going to be wool or cashmere or whatever, same thing with fabrics. You just feel the fabric. If it feels lightweight and flimsy, it probably is not something you want to pick up unless it's vintage. But if it feels thick and like maybe it would be wool, you can be tricked. I've been tricked by velvet before. There's cotton velvet and there's synthetic velvet, and the cotton velvet does a lot better as far as resale and also working with. So seamstresses are looking for higher end stuff. A lot of these guys that you see selling on eBay and Etsy as well, because I've had better luck selling my fabric on Etsy actually, they are distributors. But if you just find it in the thrift store and you are going through and looking through sheets or whatever, you know, linens and those types of things, and you run across some fabric, here's a base knowledge of what you might want to stop and check out a little further. So there's wool, and that sell-through rate is about a quarter to a half, somewhere in there. This is Kate Spade. There aren't a lot of results, but I did want to point it out because we're going to start to see this more in the stores since she has passed. And this is also a high-end brand. This is the other reason why I wanted to point this out. This is Crevette, which is, or Crevet is the more proper pronunciation. I'm not exactly sure. I've never heard anyone. It's not in any of the stores that I go to. I order this stuff online, so I don't really know how to say it, but it's Kate Spade, and I can show you. So here again is the selvage edge of this fabric, and if you look right there, it says Kate Spade, New York for Crevet, and that is what you're looking for, always on the selvage edge for the manufacturer name, and then if it's by a designer. The last type of fabric is the fabric that I picked up. It's IKEA. It sells probably a 50% sell-through rate. So is Kate Spade as well. I just did IKEA fabric instead of IKEA fabric by the yard because it is in demand. People make curtains and, you know, they aren't able to finish their project, or their curtain gets worn down or something happens to it. The cat shreds it, so they need to replace them. It's hard to find the fabric because they change their fabric lines every year or so. So certain things get more and more popular. They tend to have really mid-century modern look designs to them. On the selvage edge, they always say IKEA, so it's super easy to find them. So the other thing to think about, this sold for $75, but that's because it's 6 yards. So the more yardage you can get, the better, because people are looking for it for projects. If you just have a little scrap of fabric, it's probably not going to sell for much. So the piece that I found, if it had been a full yard, I think it probably would have been worth closer to $15 to $20. But because it was cut down the middle, it is not worth as much. But it'll give you the year and IKEA. So that is the selvage edge you're looking for with IKEA. And they have a really solid sell-through rate. And the last thing I want to show you is looking up a burn test. There's all kinds of YouTube videos on what you're looking for. There are charts you can look for. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole and figure out exactly what it is that you bought and whether it's wool or cotton or a synthetic fabric, then those are all good keywords to put into your title that people are looking for. Fabric by the yard is a good keyword. The manufacturer, so what it says on the selvage, is important to put in the title. The length of fabric that you have and how wide. So usually I'll put, like that one fabric that I showed you earlier, 44 inches by 45 inches. You can add centimeters into your title so that you can appeal to a bigger audience, since the United States is the only one that's still on the imperial system. Everyone else in the world uses meters, so if you want to put how many meters it is, you can do that as well. So that's it for fabrics. Hope this was helpful. They don't sell for a ton of money, but they are easy to ship, just like patterns, and relatively easy to find. If you know what you're looking for, they can be a phenomenal seller. They are long tail, so be forewarned, you might have that fabric for 6 months. So if you are looking for a quick flip, don't do fabric. But if you are willing to hang on to it for a while, you can actually, like Star Wars fabric, if it's decent quality, if it's not paper thin, which some of that stuff that came out of Joann's, if it's VIP, don't pick it up. That generally does not sell for very much. Just go into Joann's and look at the fabric brands that they sell and avoid those. But if you can find some of the higher end brands or vintage fabric, if it feels thick and it looks cool, you'll probably be able to sell it. So with that, go out and find some fabric, and we'll see you on Monday.